I want to pick up a comment which has been made by Princhep666. The people of Crimea say Crimea is Russia. Those are the only people who have any say in the matter. Your propagandistic tales are laughable. Tony Dick adds, I feel compelled to agree. I've dealt with this a few times in the past, and I'm going to deal with it decisively now, I hope. A referendum conducted during wartime or at the point of a gun is inherently invalid. And if we apply this to Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 and to the so-called referendums or referenda held in Crimea and the Donbas, then I hope that draws a line under this absurd Russian claim. In international law, a referendum is valid only if it is free, conducted without coercion, fair, accessible to all eligible voters without intimidation, and informed with a full understanding of the options. These principles derive from three bits of international legislation: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR in 1966, Articles 1 and 25, which guarantee the right to self-determination and the right to participate in genuine elections by universal and equal suffrage by secret ballot, guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the electors. Second is the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2625 in 1970, the Declaration on Principles of International Law, which specifies that self-determination must be exercised freely and not under the threat of violence or the use of force. And finally, the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, part of the OSCE framework, which commits signatories, including Russia, to respect borders and the rights of people to self-determination, explicitly rejecting territorial changes brought about by force. Therefore, a referendum held under military occupation or armed threat is prima facie invalid. In February 2014, I think actually this really goes back to 2012, Russian soldiers, little green men with no insignia, seized strategic positions across Crimea. Ukraine was not at peace. It was facing internal unrest, external invasion caused by Russia. In March 2014, under Russian military control, a referendum was rushed through within 2 weeks without international observers or legal oversight. The ballot was itself absurd. Voters were asked whether they wished to join Russia or restore Crimea's 1992 constitution, which implied de facto independence. There was no option to maintain the status quo as part of Ukraine. The Venice Commission, the Council of Europe's advisory body on constitutional law, declared the March 21, 2014 referendum a thing which violated the Ukrainian constitution, which requires a national referendum for territorial changes, Article 73, and that it was contrary to basic international standards. The United Nations General Assembly Resolution 68-262 on the 27th of March 2014 affirmed the territorial integrity of Ukraine, recognizing Crimea as Ukrainian territory and declaring the referendum invalid. Moreover, the ICCPR and UN Charter both prohibit acquisition of territory by force, an essential rule since the end of World War II. Therefore, Crimea's referendum was the political equivalent of a forced confession under duress, meaningless and illegal. Similarly, in May 2014, referenda, and I use the word referenda or referendums interchangeably. The word is a new word, it's not an old Latin word, and therefore it doesn't really justify having a Latin plural like referendum, but people use it. So let's recognize reality rather than try to impose some sort of casual conformity. These regions were active war zones in Donetsk and Luhansk. In May 2024, when referenda were held again. The armed groups, some local, some Russian-backed or Russian-imported, controlled the territory. Voting was chaotic, undocumented, and often conducted at gunpoint without electoral lists. There was no neutral observation. The OSCE was barred. The Office for the International High Commission for Human Rights described the referendums as conducted in a climate of insecurity and intimidation and therefore illegitimate. Again, force and fear void consent. The later referendums in the Donbas area equally conducted absolutely under warfare. And then the definition by Putin in Moscow that the 4 oblasts were Russian, again, illegal. Russia didn't begin its campaign in 2014. For decades it ceded population distortion. Following the Soviet deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944, Stalin settled ethnic Russians into Crimea, changing its demographic structure. By 2001, according to Ukraine's census, ethnic Russians comprised 58.5% of Crimea's population, despite Crimea historically being Tatar majority, something that President Erdogan has flagged up. In the Donbas, Soviet-era policies incentivized migration from Russia, creating a Russian-speaking majority in cities like Donetsk and Luhansk. Therefore, when Russia later claimed to be protecting Russian speakers, it was in part protecting a demographic landscape it had artificially engineered. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once noted that totalitarian states manufacture the conditions that justify their own aggression. Russia's population engineering exemplifies this dark art. Wartime referenda are invalid because true self-determination demands freedom from coercion. Russia's actions in Crimea and Donbas constitute not self-determination but armed annexation. Population engineering through historical resettlement undermines claims of indigenous consent, and the international legal order embodied by the UN Charter, the ICCPR, and the Helsinki Final Act stands firmly against such territorial seizures. To accept the Crimean referendum would be to legitimize conquest masked by democracy, a grievous regression to a world where might makes right, and that, as history teaches us, is a road paved with catastrophe. So, if anybody, Tony, Dick, and other anonymous Russian trolls, I can only assume that's what they are, wish to keep pushing on about the idea that there's a referendum that justifies Russia's acquisition of Crimea, check out the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, Articles 1 and 25, UN General Assembly Resolution 2625 in 1970, the Declarations on Principles of International Law, the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, the UN General Assembly Resolution 68262 in 2014 on Ukraine's territorial integrity, the European Commission for Democracy Through Law, the Venice Commission, opinion number 762 2014 on 21st of March 2014, the UN OHCHR report on the human rights situation in Ukraine on the 15th of June 2014, and the Ukraine National Census in 2001, Crimea's ethnic composition. I don't think there's any more to be said except that the sort of rubbish which is justifying this inhumanity needs to be exposed and needs to be spelt out. I hope this contributes a little bit to that.